We argue a lot over different Bible translations we have, and we argue about circumstances surrounding the second coming of Jesus, but most people in the world haven't heard about his first coming and haven't read about it.
Welcome to Season 4 of ECHOS International's podcast, The Same Commission.
I'm Jim Armstrong.
And I'm Matthew Pitts.
And together we explore all things mission with a guest each week.
So if you don't know much about cross-cultural mission,
or you've been a faithful supporter for years,
this is the podcast for you. Well, welcome back to the Same Commission podcast with ECHOS International.
Yeah, we're delighted to have another podcast with Lindsay Brown, the third of our 3 podcasts.
Now, if you've picked up this episode first, just to introduce Lindsay. Lindsay is based in Wales and has been involved with student ministry through IFES for over 45 years. He's also headed up the Fellowship of Evangelists in the universities of Europe and served as the international director of the Lausanne Movement.
But again today he's bringing us his expertise to bear in the topic of growth and opportunities for mission in the 21st century.
In the second episode actually, we looked at five challenges or opportunities for mission in the 21st century, Lindsay, and picked up on a number of different really interesting topics. We've 5 more today, and so to kick it off, one of the challenges that we've discussed, one of the opportunities really as well, is that of a Bible translation, in order to make sure that people have the scriptures in their heart language. So what role will that play in our setting, and what can we be praying for, thinking of in terms of Bible translation?
Well, Bible translation is crucial, of course, because as the Bible defines itself in the Old Testament in a beautiful phrase, that the scriptures are the voice of God. So when Christians say that God has spoken to me, the normative way in which God speaks is through Scripture. That is his voice. God can speak through other means, through dreams, visions, through the advice of other Christians, through circumstances. But the primary way we hear God's voice is through reading the text of Scripture. As Billy Graham said, it's like God's love letter to us. So as we read the pages of Scripture, we see of God's love and his grace and so many other things he wants us to learn about, which is why it's really important to translate the scriptures into the heart languages of people so they can read and understand it. As one person said in Congo, when the Bible was translated into one of their local languages, "Oh, God speaks my language too." So it is vitally important. I think it has to be said that the various Bible agencies have done a magnificent job over the years in translating scripture. As I understand it, there are over 6,500, maybe 6,860 is what I was told, languages that are still alive in the world. But the majority of them still don't have any scripture in their language, and that many people don't even have the scriptures in their first language or even portions. Perhaps as few as 800 have the Bible or the New Testament in their own language. More would have access to a text of Scripture in a second language. For up-to-date figures, you'd probably need to ask Wycliffe Bible translators or get their newsletters for information. In recent years, since 1989, all the Bible agencies in the world have been meeting together to dialogue about how they can partner to engage in translation. And I think it has to be said it's one of the best models of partnership amongst mission agencies anywhere in the world in the last 35 years. It's very impressive. I think they meet every year to dialogue about where the gaps are in terms of people who need to have the scriptures available to them. Not just written, but also read out as well. I think that's very important, because one of the challenges facing us in the world is that many people are oral learners so they don't have the benefit of much formal education. Many people around the world have left school at 13 or even younger. And so listening to the reading of Scripture is as important as actually reading it. So I would commend agencies that are involved in recording the reading of the text of Scripture as well, so people can have access to them. I would say the best contribution we can make is to support those ministries. It's still pivotal. It's probably one of the top 3 or 4 challenges facing us. Commend them for their partnership. And also bring the needs before our congregations to see if God will raise up some folks to contribute. I remember visiting Congo myself some years ago, and I met somebody there who had been a student in Swansea University where he was converted, and he was involved in the translation of Scripture. This was 35 years after he graduated, spent his whole life working on it, because he said, I leave a legacy behind me for these people. And the person who went there as his co-worker came and had a year with us when we were living in France. God called her into Bible translation. She's just retired in the last few months, but is advising and training other Bible translators. So it's a great ministry that needs to be encouraged and supported.
Particularly in the UK or the West, where we have so many different versions of Bibles, and we take it for granted, but Bible poverty is a huge thing. Yeah. And as I said, I was saying to you earlier on, we have a relationship with Wycliffe and James Poole, not so much in terms of the numbers of Bible languages there are, but the rate in which new Bibles are coming on FEUER was just really, really encouraging. So it is a real opportunity.
I think actually it's worth signposting people back to that
podcast,
very early episode
yes.
in season 1 if you want to find out more.
The most challenging statement I heard when it comes to Bible translation is that we argue a lot over different Bible translations we have, and we argue about circumstances surrounding the second coming of Jesus, but most people in the world haven't heard about his first coming and haven't read about it in the text of Scripture.
Well, that's a fantastic segue into the next opportunity, which is the unreached people groups. And we talk about it a lot, but again, it's good to just be reminded of the opportunity we have.
Well, this term unreached people groups really was brought to the global awareness in 1974 in the Lausanne Congress, when a little-known missionary called Ralph Winter, who was working in Guatemala, was given 15 minutes to share about his work at the Lausanne Congress, where various other great speakers, well-known speakers, were speaking, like Stott and Billy Graham and so on. And he said, when we've read about the gospel and the nations, or spoken about them, we have unfortunately thought in terms of nation states. And the UN says there are, something like 200 nation states in the world. And he said this is a construct of Europeans in the 1800s who created a lot of nation states. But he said it's not the way in which nations are referred to in the Bible. And he referred to the passage in Revelation 7 and elsewhere, where it talks about people from every language, tribe, and nation being in heaven. And he said the term for nation is really a people group who are defined primarily by their language. So he said, if you define a nation in those terms by a group which has a language, there are many thousands. And in some cultures, some countries like India or Nigeria, you have many, or Papua New Guinea, many different language groups. So you have a people group. And he said, though the church may be present in every nation state, which it wasn't quite at the time, 74, it is now. There's a church in every nation state in the world, or a group of believers. He said, if you think in terms of people groups who are distinguished by their language, there are many more, perhaps these days, perhaps as many as 200 people groups in the world with 100,000 population who speak the same language, who don't have a viable church or a small group or the scriptures. And the church needs to think of how to effectively reach those. That led to the creation of an agency called Adopt a People in North America afterwards, which reshaped the missionary budgets of many churches in North America, who decided upon the challenge to challenge their congregation to adopt a people, to give to financial support for a ministry beginning there, and even for some missionaries to go to those people groups that had no Christian presence. It had almost no impact on the British Evangelical Church at all, where perhaps as much as 75% of the money that we send on the people goes to quite a small percentage of people groups around the world. Certain countries, like some African countries, like Kenya, had a huge number, a disproportionate number of missionaries. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it was appropriate to have a rethink at that time. And I still think that British mission agencies, though some of those who are more progressive is not the right word, but more holistically biblical in their approach, have begun to try to reverse this or address this weakness in terms of challenging their readership or those who support the ministry to consider taking the gospel to people groups where as yet no ministry exists. Some mission agencies came into existence, like I think it was Frontiers with Greg Livingston, who began work with 300 unreached people groups without stopping the support of ministries that have a valid ministry. Again, it's a question of balancing out the focus and opening the doors so people can be educated, taught to understand there are large groups of people who either don't have scripture or have never seen a missionary or a home group or seen the Jesus film in many parts of the world that still need to be reached. They are significant. The number is coming down. It was well over 300, I think 350 people groups in 2010 at the Cape Town Congress, but I would reckon it's under 200 now with a population of 100,000 in each, but they still exist and they need to be reached. Some of them will be reached by neighbouring people groups whose language is similar, but there's still a role also for some people who will sense that God's calling them for a lifetime to serve in that capacity.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We'll stop there for a moment. Join us again in a minute or so as we continue our discussion.
Ready, set, go. Welcome to First Serve, a gap year like no other. Learn to serve local, and serve global.
It's so exciting, and I would 100% recommend this programme to anyone.
On my first Serve Gap year, I'm most looking forward to experiencing other cultures and also speaking to other people about God.
This is First Serve. Find out more at first-serve.org.uk.
You're listening to the same commission, and we're focusing on challenges and opportunities affecting mission today.
It's interesting because the next thing that we've got on the list to discuss is this idea of migration and diaspora, which does speak into the theme of unreached people groups, because people groups move, and there's greater opportunity. What would you say to someone listening to this who is sort of seeing migration maybe as a primarily political issue, something that's in the news a lot? What's the missional aspect?
Well, first of all, I think governments are in a difficult position because it is appropriate to care for those who are persecuted or threatened by death in some cultures. At the same time, if a government overinvests in migrating peoples, it runs the risk of disenfranchising its own people. So there has to be a balance there, and governments don't always find it. I think there's a difference between economic migrants and those who are migrating because their lives are under threat. So we need to exercise compassion, but also balance in caring for their own people, which is why so many people are dissatisfied here, because they feel natural-born British people, especially those who have lower incomes, are feeling disenfranchised to some extent. So there needs to be some better framework than there has been there. In terms of the question of migrating peoples, if you start with the question of what was God's strategy for expanding the church in the New Testament, it seems to have been twofold in the Acts of the Apostles. One was sending people to new places, like the Apostle Paul. The other was bringing people to places where they would hear the gospel as part of a migrating people. And the classic case is Antioch in Acts 7 and 13, where you have a group of elders in the church, which included somebody from North Africa, from Kyrenia, which is present-day Libya, also somebody called Niger from Black Africa, as it were, Barnabas from Cyprus. So it was a multi-cultural leadership. One of the radical dimensions to the New Testament church was that it was multicultural. It is very difficult to build a multicultural church. We shouldn't hide the challenges, because people can be frustrated or hurt if they don't feel understood. As somebody said in a minority group in a church, I agree that we need sensitivity, but why is it always those of us who are from the minority group who have to make the biggest accommodation? Which is a fair challenge. Having said that, the church seemed to have grown through the migration of people as well in the New Testament. And if you read the Acts of the Apostles, you have to ask the basic question: name to me one person who was converted at home other than Timothy. Almost no one. Answer. Starting in Acts 2, where you have a list of people from 13 different people groups and languages, including Arabs separated from North Africans, and various other ethnic groups, Elam, Parthians, Medes, and so on, who heard the gospel in Acts 2. And one of the distinctive lessons from the day of Pentecost is the gospel reaching people who were away from home.
Yes.
When I visited Albania a few years ago, somebody told me that one Catholic priest who's a historian has just discovered documentation that in the key port in Albania, in AD 53, there were 70 Christian families, probably occurring because of the day of Pentecost and people coming back from there 20 years earlier. And that was the consequence. So that's partly how the gospel spread. Philip was converted away from home. Paul was converted away from home. Probably Barnabas was converted away from home, and so many others in the Acts of the Apostles. The Ethiopian eunuch, biggest student movement in the world today, Ethiopia. One of the fastest growing churches in the world today, 200,000 baptisms every year, Ethiopia. Where were the roots? Acts of the Apostles. So you have in the Acts of the Apostles an indication of how God worked in terms of people going away from home to hear the gospel. As Tom Houston, the famous Scottish theologian and leader of Lausanne, said to me on one occasion, Lindsay, migration in missiological terms is the only game in town. He told me that in 2009, and you can see that being fleshed out today. It's important to engage with people when they are away from home. Often they are culturally away from their roots. They're more open to hear the gospel. And that's where churches often have a significant role to play in ministry of compassion as we welcome people, not being blind to the challenges that migration produces, but reaching out to people when they're away from home, recognizing they're made in God's image, that we are told to, in King James terms, love the alien as you love yourself. It's not, alien is not a word we would use so much, but love the foreigner or somebody from another culture, just as we would like to be accepted. I had this experience when I lived in Paris and I didn't speak any French. I felt like a child. And, you know, I'd been working in Christian ministry for 4 years already, but suddenly I couldn't say anything other than bonjour or bon appetit. And it took a while to be gently welcomed into the home of French Christians. So I think our role is to see the opportunities to reach people when they're away from other cultures, but also that some believers are migrating and they can also help us in reaching out. We have in our church in Cardiff, we have a couple from India who've served in the church in Dubai and also now lead our ministry amongst people who've migrated to Cardiff. We also have a worker from Friends International in the church who coordinates their work across Wales, and they do phenomenal work. I went to one of their mothers and toddlers things, sitting talking with people from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait who were there with their children, and I thought I could never do this in these countries. So it creates gospel opportunities for us, but also some of these people may rise to leadership positions. We've had 2 elders, one from India, one from Cambodia, whose parents moved to South Wales, and now the children are in positions of leadership. So I think there are those 2 dimensions, the evangelistic, but also learning from and benefiting from believers from other cultures, some of whom may rise to leadership positions. It's a challenge and not easy to pull it off to develop a multicultural church, because instinctively and naturally we like to be with people who have the same roots as ourselves. But part of the radical nature of the New Testament is that it was a multicultural church. The New Testament, dare I say, never talks about uniquely Welsh church or Scottish church or Filipino church or Chinese church.
No, I agree.
Or Korean church. And we have to gently help one another to realize that the church is local but also universal.
Yeah.
And we should not just long for a meeting with our own people who fit into our own neat little culture. So it's a big challenge missiologically, but it does seem to be part of God's strategy for advancing the cause of the gospel worldwide.
I mean, ultimately, we're going to be in a place where we're all going to stand shoulder to shoulder with every nation in the world.
So we got to learn to live with them now.
Exactly.
And actually, there is a picture of that new creation, isn't there? As church, particularly when we see churches of a multicultural kind of composition.
I mean, I think you're right. We've got to watch as well, though, because we can sometimes make the migration of people a simple thing, and it's not. There's all sorts of complications in it. But needless to say, and it's been said oftentimes before, and this is a link into the next opportunity, taking the unreached people groups and bringing them to where they can hear the gospel. And megacities is another good example of that, talking about these huge places with there's a myriad of different people groups. So just touch on that for a little bit for us if you can.
Well, the term megacities was invented by geographers who defined megacities. My wife was by training initially a geographer. Defined megacities as populations of 1 million people and more. Now, if you use that definition, in 1900 there were only 11 megacities in the world with 1 million or more. In 2000 it was 500. So you can see increasing urbanization globally. It may be 750 now, but 75% of the world lives in major urban centres, and it's increasing. London University did some research on this a few years ago, and the editor of, or the coordinator of this research, was a guy from the Balkans called Dejan Sujic, and in it he said memorably, megacities are the only game in town. In other words, that's the direction the world...
There's lots of these only games in town.
Yeah, people tend to do that if they're doing research in it. But of course, all of them are important. But what he was saying was that's the direction of the world. Now, again, like all the other issues we've talked about, there's a question of balance here.
Yeah.
If you overemphasize urban centres, you can easily make people feel inferior if they're working in agrarian contexts. But God is concerned for those people too. And many of the best missionaries have done really good work in agrarian contexts or where people are working in small villages and so on. We should not downplay that. No. The gospel is for the whole world. Having said that, if you want to think strategically, there's no doubt that the world is becoming increasingly urbanized. But the interesting parallel is the ministry of Jesus and Paul. Paul targeted the urban centers, the megacities of the first century, Corinth, Ephesus, and so on, Jesus spent his whole ministry, past, it seems from the last few weeks, in these dinky little villages in Galilee, which is like saying, go and work in the Welsh coal mining valleys. So that at the day of Pentecost, they said, who are all these people? They're uneducated Galileans, which God had seen blessed to reach through the person of Jesus himself. So there is that biblical balance which we must maintain missiologically. What some missiologists tend to do, and this can happen in the Lausanne Movement and elsewhere, is ask the question, what's new?
Yeah.
Or what are the trends? It's appropriate to ask that question, but not be dictated to it by it. What we should be dictated to by biblical principles and patterns and God's way of working in Scripture. That's our source. While we're looking at the contemporary world. Having said that, when people gather together in major cities, many are away from home. It's a way for reaching migrating people. Many of the big missiological challenges exist, like some people are very wealthy. You can reach business people in communities, but also you have the urban poor who need to be reached. So there needs to be an appropriate strategy. Now, one of the people who did the best work on this was Tim Keller, the well-known American pastor who died just a couple of years ago, who developed, actually, as a result of a meeting over coffee with two other people in Cape Town in 2010. It had nothing to do with the plenary session. One of them said to him, who was a banker, said to him, what are you doing these days, Tim? And he said, well, I'm working in Manhattan in the city. I'm having to develop a different strategy there. And he said, well, that's a problem globally, isn't it? And they formed City to City after they'd finished their bacon and egg and their cup of coffee, which is a very significant influence these days. I would say you can connect with or read their material about how to reach people in the cities. Again, some of the challenges are more complex than some people make out, and there's always danger in taking a strategy used in one city like New York and saying it has to be the same everywhere else. People have to think in a fresh way about our own cultural context as well as the big challenge. But it's one of the big issues of our day, and some people will need to engage in that. The work published by London University is called The Endless City, if you want to look at the research.
We've covered a lot of ground, but so we'll call this the bonus one. But it's in a conversation we had with you, we were talking about approaches to particularly engaging some of the other major world religions, and perhaps sometimes in the UK context, we get more worried about engaging atheists and proving the existence of God and things like that. But actually, in terms of the world at large, there's a big missiological challenge to engaging Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, who sometimes have, in some ways, very, very similar views of God. There might be monotheists or very different views of God, or not God. What would you say we need to be thinking of in the coming years, missiologically, in relation to other world religions?
There have been some advances in terms of reaching Muslims, much more in the last 20, 30 years than perhaps virtually at any time in history. There have been some great models. I think I mentioned the name of Charles Marsh recently in an earlier podcast, but some others in terms of reaching Muslims. Also some controversies in terms of reaching what some people call hidden Christians, or
the insider movement.
The insider movement, which has its weaknesses and its strengths, because we're not in that situation, of course, having grown up in this cultural context. So we need to encourage people to be sensitive if they become believers when they're in a Muslim majority location. At the same time, when you read the words of Jesus, he does imply there's going to be persecution and suffering. I remember talking with a Nigerian guy in a conference in Nigeria, and I asked him what he was doing. He said, I'm a missionary in northern Nigeria. I said, is it tough up there? He said, well, I grew up in a Muslim home in a village. And he said somebody came one day and just left tracts in the street. And I picked one up and I was converted on my own. I was 13. I went and told my father. He tried to kill me. And he said he got a knife to kill me, and he missed me as I ducked and stabbed my brother in the leg. He said my mother then jumped on him, stopped him from killing both his sons, and his brother hadn't become a Christian at that point, and some of the other men in the village stopped him. And I said, well, what happened then? He said, I couldn't leave. I was 13. I was in the family. But over a period of 5 years, my father saw the change in my life. He was converted. And then he told the men in the village. And they told him, you've got a few days to give this up, or you will face the punishment. And he refused, and they killed him in front of us. So he said, I've gone back to that area now taking the gospel. And this is a totally unknown Nigerian missionary. Okay, he's not written any book, nobody. Yeah. But he was talking to me about the cost of becoming a believer in that situation. Now, in some cultures, it's a little bit easier than in some others, but there can be a cost. So there needs to be some sensitivity. But there are many books being written now about many Muslims becoming Christians in certain countries. I think especially since two things have happened. The disillusionment with Islam in some countries, like Iran, and especially with the extremist groups in North Africa. There was a case of a number of Egyptian workers who were executed and beheaded in Libya, and they put it on Al Jazeera on the news, the actual showing that they were beheaded. And it created outrage in Egypt amongst many Muslims who were from a softer group who said, it's like nominal Christians. They said, we didn't know the Quran had anything to say about this, killing people because they believe in a different God. We don't want anything to do with it. So some Egyptian leaders in Cairo then said to me, do you have any tips about how to reach atheists? I said, well, you haven't got many in Egypt, have you? They said it's the biggest, the fastest growing group in the country, with people who've left Islam and they don't know where to go. And in one church, the biggest church in Cairo, they said, we've got more people coming to church on Sunday morning on their own from a Muslim background. We've got to employ more people to help them because they've come on their own to hear the gospel, because they're disillusioned with the Islamic view of God. So it varies. You have some extremism, but also in some contexts, like Iran, probably now one of the 2 or 3 fastest growing churches in the world, more than a million evangelicals within and outside the country. Afghanistan, many Afghans becoming believers through Iranian missionaries because the languages are so close. Yeah, it's like French and Spanish. So Iranian believers are reaching out to them. So there are wonderful stories. We should back those people. Maybe one of the things we should do in mission agencies is look for ministries working through people who ethnically come from those backgrounds that are like cousins, and sponsoring them in some way. We could partner with them as trainers and teachers, because often they are dynamic ministries but not always very well structured. So there must be room for partnership there. That doesn't mean there's no room for Western missionaries amongst Muslims, like Charles Marsh was, who exercised a remarkable ministry over close to 50 years. And after he died, the growth of the church in Algeria was in part due to the legacy he left behind. There has been some significant growth in reaching Hindus, particularly lower caste Hindus, through the Good Shepherd movement, which was born in OM. Yeah. And many so-called untouchables have become believers through the kindness and compassion of believers. And in the north of the country, there's a remarkable ministry, an indigenous ministry amongst Muslims there too, which doesn't have as many contacts with the West. The area where we're not making as much progress is Buddhists and Shintoism in Japan, where the church is still very small. And I would say we need to try to work with believers groups there to see if there's any way we can partner with them. It may mean that in our mission agencies we need to both challenge believers in our cultures to target some of these places, but also secondly partner with some of the indigenous mission agencies that are beginning to work in those areas. But there is more fruit, particularly in the Islamic and Hindu world. In India, much less effective in reaching high caste Hindus, but more effective amongst the poorer folks.
Recently, Japan has opened up to missionaries again.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
You can now get a missionary visa for Japan,
which you couldn't for a number of years. So
tough country though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think I suppose tied in with that is the idea of national identity, isn't it?
Well, listen, thanks again. That's 3, I think, very interesting podcasts. Not because we are doing them, but because the information that's come out of them. So let me just say thanks again for taking a long time to go through that with us. But again, it was just exciting to catch some of the things that God is already doing and just to be able to celebrate that and worship for that as well. Well, listen, thanks again. And hopefully for our listeners, you'll be able to listen to both the first and the second podcast as well as this podcast as well. Thank you.